Hello, I'm Christina Donoghue, the Art and Culture Editor at SHOWstudio. I'm currently sat with the lovely Sofia Lai. Sofia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I am Sofia. I'm a visual artist based in London. I've done recently an art residency with SHOWstudio.
I did want to start off with the residence over this weekend. Obviously, it was for London Gallery Weekend, which for anyone who doesn't know is when I think it involves 130 galleries all around London, kind of open to the public, become free, and it's like a massive festival for people who want to see lots of art. So we obviously did our live residence with you. We called it INTERDEPENDENCE, which will then eventually become an exhibition of your work very shortly, which is really exciting. But can you start off by talking about, I know INTERDEPENDENCE was your choice,
Yeah.
and you wanted to call the exhibition of your work, that title, with a set meaning behind it relating to your sculptures. And I was just wondering if you could start by expanding on that for me.
It's quite interesting as a question because when I sort of realized that I was doing this residency and with people coming that I don't know what I was doing the work into the space, I was quite scared because it was the first time that I was actually doing my own sculpture along with people that I don't know, or eventually someone, because usually I'm most of the time on my own doing this. So I was quite scared, because you never know the reaction of someone looking at your work. And most of the time, I don't know, I relate a lot to the gesture of people, also in terms of expression. And I was quite scared in seeing the reaction by looking at me doing the sculpture.
Because you take a lot from people's expressions, right? You're
a lot.
Okay.
But instead, the interesting part that I was thinking actually yesterday when I was going back home, I thought it was actually quite amazing to feel the connection, on a deeper level with people that you don't know that eventually come in. They don't know you, so they don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And they ask you questions.
Yeah.
Which I found so interesting because when you do this kind of artwork, or at least for me, it's more something that you do for yourself. So by having someone that you don't know there, present while you're doing them, I don't know, I was thinking yesterday, maybe something of them, it's inside of this culture as well.
Like they've helped inform your work almost.
Probably.
I mean, I think if people were, people have come in over the weekend, they've interacted with your work, they've asked you questions, they've taken photos. Naturally, I think, even if he said as an artist, no, that doesn't influence my direction at all, I think that would be a lie. There's no way 100%. You can't help that influence your work, especially considering your work is so rooted in people.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk about that in relation to the theme Interdependence.
Yeah.
And why you chose that title.
I mean, for me, Interdependence is a continuation of a series. The idea that I have since I started.
So it started as an artist?
Yeah.
Okay.
Which was eventually this concept of, I used to call it sense of a place. Because I always relate to myself and my experience eventually, because that's what I know. So I always believe artists, the most meaningful art that I've seen, or at least that touched me, comes from a state that the artist is aware of what he's doing, not pretending to do something else.
Yeah.
And for me, I always found super interesting, because I come from Florence, which eventually is a very small city. For me, the perception that I had when I moved to London was okay, wow, what is going on?
Yeah, totally different. Yeah.
Totally different, and for me was good and bad at the same time to see how, despite there are billions of people, nobody sees each other. And so for me, interdependence in that sense comes along from a sense of a place. Is the perception that you have of a space in relation to your background.
When was it when you came to London? What year was it?
It was in 2015.
Okay, so it was just the year before the Brexit referendum as well. So, oh my God, that would have been, I'm sure, quite an interesting time as someone who's not English, came from Italy, and then experienced that kind of change over a year that was so dramatic that so many people reported on feeling isolated, but amongst a sea of so many other people.
Yeah, and that was the idea, and I feel like you need to be able and self-conscious of the strength of coming from a different place, because eventually they allow me and put me in a perspective that I'm able to see, not because I'm amazing compared to other people, but mainly because I have a different background compared to others, so I'm able to see as everyone else, things in a unique way, which
It's
is your
definitely
own.
always a strength. I think.
I think about my sister,
Yeah.
like despite we have grown up together, we have different perspective of different situations. So the way that we perceive and see things is gonna be in a unique way.
Yeah,
And that is
totally.
the strength.
Totally.
And if you try to get rid of the accent or you feel ashamed of where you come from, you're gonna lose that.
Yeah, I think that's what London. That's what, originally speaking, is so special about London, is that, it's not made up of English people, it's made up of people from absolutely everywhere. And that's why London has such a incredible kind of like identity, because there isn't an identity, it's just made up of everyone.
Yeah.
What does a Londoner look like? It doesn't look like, there's no kind of model for it.
No.
And that's what I think is so great about London.
In the way that I see it, is more about like finding your roots also somewhere else.
Totally, yeah.
Which for me, it's amazing.
Yeah. So in relation to your work and that kind of informing your work, how do you reckon that experience of you kind of coming to London as an artist, not really being aware of like, you said you originally felt shame, but you didn't want to feel like that. How do you reckon that's informed kind of this residency or your work as a whole?
I mean, this outcome here, these little puppets or sculpture, you want to call them, is the outcome of me accepting me for me. Like by representing me and by me mixed with what I see in my surroundings, it's creating that unique outcome, is accepting who you are.
So on the topic of you saying, these are like me accepting who I am, we've spoken about how a lot, like you use your own body to cast these sculptures and a lot of them are based on you. Now, considering that, as I look around at all the different ones, even though I know that they're kind of all based on your body and therefore you as a person, they're very, very different. Totally different. And we said, different personalities already in the poses and the clothing and the style and everything. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that, because I know that, inspiration for you is so wide and varied, but then each sculpture kind of seems to be inspired by a specific moment for you, whether it's like a nightmare or a man you saw on the street. And I was just wondering if you could kind of go into that.
I usually start by this idea of tenderness, that I relate a lot to people that I love. Like my grandmothers. I remember this, I have this memory of my grandmother, she went through the war and they were very poor. And when I was a kid, despite it was winter or summer, she was like, you need to wear, the healthy tank top, the wool tank top that you wear underneath the clothes?
Oh yeah. Like,
she was obsessed with that and you had to wear it like constantly.
Yeah,
and I used to hate it.
Yeah.
But that was her way. She never said, I love you, but that was her way of showing love.
Totally.
And for me, like also using like nightwears or like this kind of sheer things is like the way that I try to embrace this idea of love by something that you consider rough. But then eventually I see her alone in the room looking at herself with the gown. I don't know.
Rough in terms of like material texture?
Both but also in terms of like sort of constriction, no? Because when you're a kid and they're telling you need to do this, for me was like a constriction. So it was something like imposed, it was something negative. But instead now I translate into something positive because I can see her like sharing the love by doing that. The pose itself is not my grandma. Maybe it's someone that I saw walking in the street.
Yeah.
And I saw a movement that I really like and I'm trying to mix the two of them.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, if I try to represent them, the fact that I don't know them is what I said at the beginning, not knowing the topic, I'm not able to express myself. So this is my representation of that movement, but mixed with something that I know.
Yes, exactly. Which I think everyone always says to creatives, the best advice you can give is like practice what you know, write about what you know, make art about what you know, and it's like you can look out for inspiration and see people, as you said, just speaking to you now, see kind of movements in the street or like postures that you recognize, but you don't know the people who are inhabiting those postures.
Yeah.
And it's like mixing that with what you're familiar with, you're saying, creates something like this.
Yeah.
Like a whole different thing. If this one specifically as well, to talk about the lace on this, it really reminds me of Louise Bourgeois. She did also with these sculptures and worked a lot with like lace materials and kind of like female undergarments.
Yeah.
And that kind of mixture there, especially with the colour of the plaster, with you painting it as well, the cast. I was wondering if you could talk about that, because I think, you know, you've spoken to me before that she's a big reference point for you in some aspects, and I was just wondering if you could kind of talk on why you look to her as someone for inspiration.
I'm not sure. Actually, I started to dig into her art when I think I was like 15, 16.
Okay, so
she
quite
was,
young.
yeah, she was one of the first ever artists I approached, along with actually Michelangelo Pistoletto.
Okay, yeah.
The Venus of the Rug,
Yeah.
but it was more the idea of arte povera in general, like to embrace the idea of merging the everyday life element into art.
Yeah.
Which eventually is what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Then at the end.
Yeah, like, yeah.
And Louise Bourgeois for me was, not even in terms of visual references, she was a lot of inspiration for me in relation. I remember I saw this article that they were talking about her. She started to, since she was a kid, to have these diaries in which she was writing down, as you would do when you're a kid, like what you do throughout the day, what are your thoughts, and so on. And I was doing exactly the same. And I felt like weird in a way when you're a kid. I remember I used to wake up and write down all the dream or the nightmare that I was doing.
Yeah.
And I was keeping it, hiding it from other people because I was like, this is weird. So I was like, okay, if she do it, then it's fine. No.
I can do it too.
So I remember I started to dig into her in relation to that, and I was amused by the fact that she started from childhood trauma. Her work starts around that, and and I was like, okay, she's actually able to catch and destroy an horrible moment and create something. I mean, for me, when I look at her work, it's not, a lot of people that I spoke with, they say they are very rough. For me, they're completely like, it's the embrace of tenderness.
Do you think it's because you relate to it in a way? Like
I think so.
Because you touched on, obviously, you know, with nightmares and stuff, and you used to write them down. I know that you've told me in the past that they've kind of served as
I still do, actually.
more, a lot of it, it's quite, I mean, not common, it's a good thing, I think, because it keeps your mind active. But obviously, nightmares aren't the best to relive, but you kind of have to relive them with the work that you create, because, I mean, you've said to me that some of the sculptures are based on literal nightmares that you've had, and then you kind of like relive them by not recreating them, but definitely use them as inspiration. I was wondering if you could touch on that a bit.
If I'm able to share my nightmare with someone and eventually, you know, like you touch someone, emotionally speaking, that creates joy or relates to a painful moment, you have a connection with someone, which I think it's like something like charity does, but on a different level. But you are able to give something to people, like say, like I've shared the same moment. I know how you feel, despite we don't know each other. Maybe we are not in the same room at that moment, but you don't feel alone.
So it's about kind of going into the depths of yourself then, right? To like bring out something that I suppose you can use as like kind of creative fuel. As well, in terms of, you've told me that you studied styling and then you went into art later, like after that. I'm really interested in that, because obviously there's such a strong fashion element to your sculptures in a way that I think with other, you know, sculptors past and present there isn't. And more, you know, sculpture's always been about, well, not the body, but forms and shapes and the body with that. Whereas with your work, there's that added layer of texture and material from the fashions that you use. So, and I was just wondering if like you could talk about that mix.
I didn't start to do art afterwards, like I've always done it.
Right.
And I always loved styling, because eventually the way that I perceive styling and fashion in general, that's why like the question fashion can be considered art. It can, for me, in relation, I don't know, movements such as the anti-fashion movement. You use fashion as a tool to express a concept. So eventually, yes, that translates into art.
But anti-fashion is still very much fashion.
It is, but then you can find the combo.
Yeah.
And for me was that balance, because when I do styling, especially here, I already have in mind the identities of the people that I want to portray. So the styling comes in, but it's not, it is and it's not at the same time the primary element.
It's just part of like
It's
exaggerating
part of the
that
identity itself.
Yeah.
So it's building a character.
So do you feel like, so in terms of, your work is about building characters. Obviously, you couldn't do what you do without the fashion element.
No.
That is a really strong part. It's fun as well. And I kind of like that mix of that kind of seriousness in your work.
I think you need that.
Yeah, definitely.
Because otherwise it would be too sad. I feel like for me to find that connection, emotionally speaking, like with the viewer, not knowing you, I don't want them to go after seeing this away and think, oh gosh, I'm sad. I want them to feel like, literally, the idea of tenderness. So you feel connected with something, but it's nice, it's pleasant. You can spend a moment with the pain, and it's okay, because then eventually you get out and it is fun.
Silly, I think, is a word that I'm hesitant to use to describe your sculptures, because they're beautiful and creative, and I think they're silly, but in a, as you said, a very beautiful way that kind of puts a smile on your face.
You need that.
Rather than makes you,
I feel like that you need that.
So what would you want people to take away from your work, if anything?
I feel like just a connection and acceptance of yourself, really. Like by me saying, and it's me putting myself out in the world saying that I have nightmare, that I suffer of insomnia, I feel like it's accepted, but not really.
Right, okay. It's like still taboo.
Yeah, it's still not even a taboo, but you'd rather not to share it. Which I don't feel like that it's such a thing to share. And then if I do it, maybe someone is gonna get out of here and feel the connection with me and be like, okay, maybe I can share with someone else.
Yeah.
And they do the same. So this idea of inter-be.
Yeah, the interconnectedness.
Yeah, to build a community, but also in terms of emotion, which eventually I feel like nowadays is completely disappeared, no? Most of the time. It's the wrong perception that you have, I guess, I mean, for these of myself, that I have of myself, is what we said before. Now when you look at yourself in the mirror, you never see who you actually are. And for me, these are the weakness, and mainly, unfortunately, the weakness, but the weakness that I see in myself. But then through these, they become a sort of acceptance, and no longer weakness, but just how it is. That it's not perfect.
So on that, how has creating this work and forming these sculptures modeled off your own body kind of influenced your own relationship to your body?
It does, in a way that when you share like also by sharing, as I said, like a struggle that you might have, by sharing it already with someone, you're sort of accepting it. Because when you don't accept something and you stuck with that idea, you don't share it because you feel like it's a taboo. And you feel like, okay, I need to hide this side of me. Like, I don't know if it ever happened to you, but I have so many people that when you talk about like, oh, I cry, and they're like, oh, I don't know how you cry, I never cry. Which eventually is not true, because all of us does. But you feel like you need to say, but you feel like you need to say, I never cry. I'm so strong. What is wrong with crying? And what is wrong by looking at this and like, we all have a relationship with our body, because eventually we are stuck with it constantly.
It's also about perspective, I think, as well. Crying, it can be synonymous with weakness if you want it to be. But it can also be synonymous with so many other things. So you're in charge of how you kind of channel that emotion. So
that is the idea. And for me, by sharing it in a way that, of course, the relationship that I have with my body and the way that I perceive myself is personal. And it's not that I want to share, I have these or I think these. It's more about opening a door, really, to people to start to think and accept. It's the idea that nowadays, even if you meet someone that you don't know, and you share a moment or if I ask you, how did you felt in pandemic? And you tell me, oh, I felt a bit like depressed, I had anxiety. Doesn't matter if we don't know each other. You actually feel that connection because you have experienced exactly the same thing and you know how you felt. So that for me is the type of connection that goes over time, no? It doesn't matter if you know each other.
It's about, I think people have always found it harder to be, I mean, honest. Honesty is a hard one anyway, but honesty with strangers is something that's special and I think is quite rare.
You're trying to sell the best version of yourself.
So everyone you meet is an interview and it doesn't need to be. Yeah, and I suppose that's kind of what I get from your work. It's like that honesty that you have with your own self that then I suppose can encourage people to be maybe more honest with themselves or kind of going through the world in this kind of true state.
Because I feel like I'm not doing anything particular. It's just like taking the guts, but more with yourself to say, okay, I'm thinking this and I need to stay with this thought at least 5 minutes and think, why am I thinking it? What can I do? Can I do something to change it? Do I want to do something to change it? And sometimes a lot of people want to have this thought. They're like, okay, let's close this door. Let's think about something else.
Yeah.
And then you're stuck with that thought constantly, So that is the idea.
I suppose, yeah, as you said about like letting yourself sit with that idea, whether it's negative or positive, it doesn't really, generally speaking, it's like okay to sit with uncomfortable.
I mean, think about, like if I think about the idea of uncanny, the familiar into the unfamiliar.
Unknown, yeah.
The most relevant example is the déjà vu. The déjà vu, it makes you feel discomfort, but then eventually it can also happen with something positive.
Totally, yeah, like a fondness or a memory.
So,
what do you think of the idea if people were to say over the weekend as well, if someone who was looking at your art honestly, to use that word, said, that one makes you feel a bit uncomfortable? Would you
I'm happy if they do. That's the main purpose, because when you feel uncomfortable, you start to think.